Horrified, Lou flung the bowl away, screaming as it flipped over and spilled across the table. Everyone, or everything, stopped eating. They turned, staring at him with those dead, white eyes. Lou didn't care. He bolted for the door, crashing into someone on the way out. It was the owner. Up close, he was just as terrifying as the rest. Eyes rolled back, teeth bared. "Where you going, kid?" he snarled. "You haven't paid yet." Lou didn't answer. All he could think about was getting out. He made it to the door, but it wouldn't budge. Locked. Trapped and shaking, he fumbled for his wallet, ready to pay just to escape. The owner grabbed his arm hard, like he was about to rip it off. But instead of demanding money, he said something weird. "Don't listen to that old hag. She's full of lies." Lou didn't care who was lying or not. He just wanted out. When the door finally gave, he stumbled into the night and, of course, ran into her again. The old lady, always there. Days later, Lou was still messed up, replaying it all in his head. Who was telling the truth? The owner or the old lady? Didn't matter. After that, he swore off late-night food runs. He dropped his bad habits and started living like a normal person again. No more midnight noodles. No more games till dawn, just a regular guy trying to forget the nightmare he'd stumbled into. Here's a retelling of the story in natural, human-like English, sticking closely to the original plot and details. This creepy tale is about a guy named Lou, a young man fresh out of college but still jobless. Lou was a total gaming nut. Most of his days were spent glued to his console, playing video games non-stop. One night he was so caught up in a game that he kept going until midnight. It wasn't until he lost a match that he snapped out of it and realized he hadn't eaten dinner.
Yet,
Lately, Lou had gotten into this bad habit of eating super late, like midnight late, when everyone else in the house was already asleep. That night was no different. With his stomach growling, he stepped outside to grab something to eat. It was dark out, and all the nearby restaurants were closed, so Lou had to walk pretty far to find a place that was still open. After a while, he spotted a small noodle joint he'd never noticed before. Weird, because he'd walked this street tons of times. Without a second thought, he went inside. The owner was this bald guy with sharp, angular features. He looked kind of intimidating at first, but he had this friendly vibe whenever he greeted customers. Before Lou could even settle in, a steaming bowl of noodle soup was plopped down in front of him. Starving, Lou devoured it fast, eager to get back to his games. As he left the restaurant, a figure shuffled toward him out of the shadows. It was an old lady in tattered clothes, looking all mysterious and worn out. She held up a cracked bowl and asked for some cash. Lou wasn't exactly exciting company, pretty dull, honestly, outside of gaming, but he had a good heart. He dug into his pocket, pulled out whatever money he had left, and handed it over without hesitation. Then he hurried home. The old lady seemed like she wanted to say something, but Lou didn't stick around to hear it. The next night, Lou went back to the noodle place. There she was again, the old lady, sitting right by the door like she'd been waiting for him. As he tried to step inside, she shot up, grabbed his hand tight, and wouldn't let go. Her weird behavior freaked him out. His face went pale. He thought she might be unhinged. He tried to shake her off, but she held on like her life depended on it. She started saying some intense stuff, and Lou, totally thrown off, had no choice but to hear her out. He couldn't figure out why this lady was acting so bizarre, especially after he'd just given her money the night before. Seeing how uncomfortable he was, the old lady finally spilled everything. In a low, shaky voice, she warned him that the restaurant was bad news, like straight-up evil, and he needed to get out of there fast. Lou didn't buy it. If anything, her wild story made him more convinced she was nuts. He brushed it off, went inside, and ordered his usual bowl of noodles. This time, though, he didn't just stare at his phone like always. He glanced around, half curious. Nothing seemed off. People were eating with chopsticks, slurping their soup, same as him. He smirked to himself, thinking the old lady was definitely off her rocker, then dug into his meal. Everything felt normal. The noodles were as tasty as the night before, and Lou was already planning his next visit. On his way home, though, there she was again, the old lady. Same weird vibes. Now he was fed up. Convinced she was just some crazy person, he snapped at her. "What do you want from me? I swear I better not see you again." She didn't even flinch. Instead, she pulled a little bottle of green liquid from her pocket and told him to rub it on his eyebrows. Said it'd show him the true faces of the people in the restaurant. Annoyed and just wanting her to leave him alone, Lou grabbed the bottle and stormed off. She stood there, watching him disappear into the night. That night, Lou couldn't sleep. The lady's words kept nagging at him. He got up, grabbed the bottle, and stared at it. Why not test it out? If she was lying, he'd know for sure. So the next night, he went back to the noodle place. While everyone was eating, he snuck the bottle out, poured some of the green stuff onto his hand, and wiped it across his eyebrows. He took a deep breath, steadied himself, and turned to look around. What he saw, he couldn't even process it at first. His face went white, sweat poured down, and his whole body started shaking. The people he'd seen eating so normally, they weren't people anymore. They were corpses, lifeless, with blank white eyes and scratched up, pale skin. Some didn't even have eyes, just empty sockets. Ulcers oozed on their bodies as they shoveled noodles into their mouths like they were starving. Lou forced himself to look down, trying to calm down, but then he saw his bowl. It wasn't noodles anymore. It was a wriggling mess of maggots. He'd eaten that twice. I'm part of a volunteer search and rescue group, and every year we head out for a late summer retreat. It's a mix of team-building stuff and bonding exercises, which I love. One of the big activities is night training, practicing our search and rescue skills after dark. My role in the group is SNR K9 Handler, which pretty much sums up why I got into this in the first place. I've always wanted to work with animals. I didn't have the grades to become a vet, so joining as a dog handler felt like the perfect fit. I get to do something meaningful with my free time and hang out with dogs, though hang out is a bit of a stretch since it's serious work. You get what I mean, though. Anyway, during one of these night exercises, my dog, trained to sniff out human remains, started acting like he'd caught a scent. I was paired up with a more experienced teammate, Tara, at the time. When I glanced at her for some direction, she just shrugged and said, "Let's roll with it." Now I know what some of you might be thinking. Your dog's picking up human remains and you're not freaking out? Here's the thing. Even the best cadaver dogs mess up sometimes. We were in Washington, where it feels like we get California's yearly rainfall in a single day sometimes. Wet conditions can throw off a human remains detection, HRD dog, so false positives aren't rare. Our protocol was simple. Let the dog follow the scent. Best case, it's nothing. Worst case, we stumble across some undiscovered remains, which, yeah, is grim, but it's part of the gig. So Tara and I decided to split up for a bit. She'd stay on the trail while I followed my dog, Rusty, into the woods. We figured it'd be quick. Either he'd lose the scent or it'd fizzle out and we'd be back on track in no time. Except a few minutes turned into 10, and suddenly Rusty's leading me down this steep, sketchy slope. Next thing I know, I lose my footing and take a nasty tumble. My chest felt like it was on fire. Turned out I'd cracked 2 ribs and I could feel blood trickling from where I'd smashed my head on a rock during the fall. First thing I did was hit the emergency button on my GPS to ping base camp that I was in trouble. Second thing was start yelling for Rusty. I'd dropped his leash when I fell and I think the chaos spooked him. Either that or he just kept chasing the scent, assuming I was right behind him. I was a mess, hurting bad, disoriented, and since I'd also dropped my flashlight, I could barely see a thing. All I could do was lie there, calling for Rusty, hoping base camp had someone heading my way so I could get to a hospital ASAP. I'm not sure how long I was down there before I heard footsteps crunching closer. Relief hit me like a wave. I started shouting, "I'm here, I think I broke something," assuming it was one of our volunteers. But the second I heard the voice, I knew it wasn't anyone from our team. We do all sorts of icebreakers and bonding stuff at these retreats, so I'd recognize a teammate's voice, even the newbies. We only had 2 fresh faces that year, Meg and Darren, and this wasn't either of them. It was a man's voice, deep and unfamiliar, and when he started talking, it wasn't to help me. It sent a cold shiver right through me. He went on about how I'd landed in a dry creek bed, one that dozens of people fall into every year. Then he said at least one person dies there annually because of flash floods during the rainy season. Someone falls, gets trapped, and drowns. I went from asking for help to begging, but he just ignored me and kept talking, like he was giving some creepy little history lesson about how many people go missing or die out there. I lost it and snapped, "What the hell's wrong with you?" His response was this calm, "You're not in a position to talk to me like that." That's when I started screaming, not panicked shrieks, but loud, deliberate, "Help! Somebody! Help!" yells over and over while I fumbled uselessly for my flashlight. Screaming hurt like hell with those busted ribs, but I didn't care. Then I heard Rusty. He's part Australian Shepherd and super vocal. Lots of oh, howls, trills, and those rolling barks that basically mean, "Hurry up, human." The second Rusty started making noise, the guy stopped talking. As Rusty's barks got closer, I heard the stranger's footsteps retreating fast. Maybe a minute or 2 later, I picked up more footsteps, multiple this time, with flashlights cutting through the dark. I called out again, and soon 2 of my teammates, Lena and Marcus, were there, shining a light right on me. My first instinct was to blurt out everything about the creepy guy who'd just been there, going on about those deaths in a way that didn't sound accidental. I know it might sound nuts, but the way he talked, like those deaths excited him, it was one of the eeriest moments of my life. Lena and Marcus didn't mess around. Before patching me up, they made sure the guy was gone. Marcus swept his flashlight around while Lena asked, "Were you pushed?" When I said no, she pressed, "You sure?" They were worried this weirdo might have caused my fall. I told them he didn't push me. He just showed up after like he'd seen or heard it happen. Which, yeah, begs the question, what was he even doing out there? They stayed with me until the medic, Vince, rolled up with an ATV and a backboard to strap me onto. They got me back to base camp nice and slow, checked me over, then took me to this tiny rural clinic. Once they confirmed my ribs were broken and got me on some pain meds, the doctor said I was stable. Everyone relaxed a bit after that. The next morning, a bunch of the team swung by to see how I was doing, and I finally got to tell the whole story about the guy. The way his warnings felt more like veiled threats. About a week later, when I was home recovering, Tara called to check in. She asked how I was holding up, then dropped some news. The team leaders were talking about switching locations for next year's retreat. Turns out a couple other volunteers had spotted someone lurking around in the dark, someone who definitely wasn't one of us. After hashing it out, they decided safety came first. One of the leaders put it plain and simple. Another run-in with that shadowy creep wasn't a risk they were willing to take. I've done a handful of odd jobs in my life, and my very first was a summer gig at 16 during the break, working at a dairy farm. I hated it. The smell, the grunt work, and it really killed my drive to look for jobs afterward. I don't even remember what they called that position, something vague. But the next summer I landed a better one. Office assistant for a freelance photographer named Mara. My parents knew her through church. She'd been a member there. And my older sister had been in her 4-H program when Mara got sick. By the time I started, her health was slipping. She swore it was a mix of chronic Lyme disease and fibromyalgia. My folks warned me she was quirky, super religious, claiming she'd encountered demons and even joined a few exorcisms. I'm an atheist, long past believing in Santa, so I didn't buy her tales. Still, she seemed mostly harmless, and the job wasn't hard. Basic data entry and prepping her slightly edited photos with her company watermark before uploading them to a site where clients could browse and order. She mainly shot horse stuff, shows, rodeos, cross-country jumping, and for the first few months I worked out of her living room, which was basically my office back then. Mara eventually talked me into going with her to events, showing me the ropes as a photographer. Soon I was shooting alongside her. It was boring, honestly. I'm not into horses, but things didn't get weird until a year in. The real issue wasn't Mara. It was her 2 sons. One lived out of state, the other, Theo, was in the Navy. I'd heard snippets about Theo having autism somewhere on the spectrum, but Mara never gave a straight answer about his diagnosis. She was dead set that vaccines messed him up, blaming them for all his oddities. When he came home, I met him while working in her living room. He seemed decent, quiet, a bit reserved, but not off-putting. He was obsessed with movies, and since I'm a movie nerd too, whenever he wandered into the room and started chatting, it was always about films we liked or wanted to see. I was 18 by then. He was well into his 30s. At some point, Theo got it in his head that I liked him. He never said it to me outright. I found out through my parents. My mom's the church secretary, and she picked up on it naturally. I can only guess Mara told her. One afternoon, Theo showed up at Mom's desk, raving about how fun I was, how much he enjoyed our talks and his plans to take me to movies or his church, all these things he had in store for me. Mom was freaked out, and so was the pastor who overheard. That night she told me everything and suggested I make sure not to lead him on. I was totally confused. I'd never done anything to suggest interest. We'd never even talked about hanging out. I started feeling uneasy around him. One time I overheard him and Mara in the next room. He was talking about his Navy days while she went off about Islam's dangers. In a dead serious tone, he said if he wanted, he'd just shoot. Any Muslim he met, problem solved. Mara laughed it off like it was a joke, but something in his voice scared me stiff. I started brushing him off more, keeping talks short, saying I had work to do. He finally got his own place and moved out, so I figured that was that. Years later, I'd moved away, and Mara's business shut down. I'd added both her and Theo on Facebook, and by then I'd come out as an atheist, something I couldn't do while still at home. One night Mara messaged me about a black ring I wore with a white star and a black circle. She'd already decided what it meant, asking where I got it, then accusing me of paganism and pushing Satan. I tried explaining it wasn't that symbol, and paganism's got nothing to do with Satan, but she wouldn't hear it. So I let it go. Classic Mara, not worth fighting over. Next morning I got a message from Theo, telling me I needed to go to his church with him. I said no, and his replies got angrier, demanding I go, saying I was lost, that my life wouldn't give me answers, and finally blasting my pentagram as disgusting, claiming it opened me to possession. Knowing arguing with him was as pointless as with his mom, I blocked them both. Done with it. Then Theo started showing up at my job. He'd browse till he found me, corner me, and ramble on no matter how much I dodged him or said I had to work. My managers caught on and started stopping him whenever he showed. I wasn't making enough rent there, so I got a second job in another town. He tracked me there too. I told those managers who he was, and they'd let me hide in the back behind a locked door while they rushed his order and got him out. During one of those run-ins, while I hid, a manager came back to clock someone in on the computer. We both heard Theo yelling toward us, "I know you remember me." That was the breaking point. They told him his business wasn't welcome anymore. He stopped showing at my other job too, and for a while it was a relief. I got used to not scanning parking lots for his truck. Fast forward a few years, I'd settled into not worrying. Then he popped up again. He was browsing a section I passed through, spotted me, and froze like a deer in headlights. I bolted to the break room, freaked out. He kept appearing after that. I'd dodge him, but he'd find me, knowing I was still there. I wrestled with telling my managers, didn't want to seem paranoid since he hadn't done anything lately. Calling me a coward or idiot might be fair, but that was my headspace. What happened next made me wish I'd spoken up. One night he caught me at the customer service desk. He walked up, said hi. I scanned for someone to signal so I could slip away, but before I could say a word, he said something that turned my stomach. "She's 3 now, right?" I stared, horrified. I'd blocked him on everything, social, media, phone, moved to a new address, hadn't seen or spoken to Mara since the ring thing. I'd never told either I'd married or had a kid. I wasn't linked to anyone they knew. "How's your husband?" he asked when I didn't answer. "He's fine. He's a good man," I mumbled, trying to shut down any idea I was available, that I wanted nothing to do with him. "Really? Where's he work?" I felt faint. Luckily, a coworker came by to grab some forms, and I bailed while he was leaving. He called back, "I'll see you again. We'll talk more, do something together. Well, I told my managers everything, how he knew about my family when he shouldn't. They pulled his face from security cameras. I didn't hear anything after, but I assume they got to him. I haven't seen him since. It's been 10 years of this. If he shows up again, I'm done. I'll call the cops right away. I just want him to stop." A few years ago, I was deep into skateboarding. I didn't have many friends to skate with, so I was always scoping out new people to join me. At the skate park, I met this really friendly guy named Rune. He was super driven about making friends and building a skate crew, constantly posting clips and photos on social media. We got along great. He seemed laid back, so I thought, why not? I gave him my phone number, and at first, everything was cool. A few days later, I picked him up, we skated, and he was still chill, no weird vibes. I dropped him off, and things felt normal. Then, a few days later, I was at school when he texted asking to skate. I was tied up and didn't reply for an hour. In that time, he blew up my phone. "Why aren't you answering? What did I do? I'm sorry." It was odd, but I wrote it off as nothing major. That night, he begged me to come skate. It sounds ridiculous now, but based on our last hangout, I figured maybe he had some kind of autism or something. It was a questionable call, but I went anyway. The whole time we hung out, it was totally fine. Same friendly, motivated Rune, no alarm bells. After I dropped him off, though, it all went downhill. A few days later, the same thing happened. He texted. I was busy, didn't reply right away, and he lost it. I didn't respond all day or night, and over the next week he sent hundreds of messages. At first it was clingy stuff. aggressive in a needy way. I guess that's how I'd describe it. Then it turned straight up delusional. We'd met when I was 19, but he sent messages reminiscing about when we were kids, saying he'd come over, take his shirt off, and we'd play. I felt sorry for him. He seemed like a good dude with a big heart, just severely unhinged. I wished he had more people in his life to help him manage whatever was going on. Then the calls started. Hundreds of voicemails, all dead silence. I could hear him breathing or a fan whirring in the background. It creeped me out. That went on for months. I thought maybe he'd lost my number or forgotten me. But after a quiet spell, he started calling again from unknown numbers. I couldn't block him. It dragged on for about a year. One time, someone came to our house and trashed the front yard, broke through the gate, messed stuff up. We weren't positive it was him, but we installed cameras after that. The worst of it was mostly the non-stop calls. Once, he used what I assume was his mom's phone. A message said, "This is Rune's mom, just wondering why he won't talk to me again." Then he texted from his own number, "Don't bother my mom." I'd replied to the earlier text, asking if he was okay and saying he needed help, but that was the end of it. After about a year, it all died down. I'm not sure what happened to him, but I hope he got the help he needed and is doing all right now. This story kicks off when my sister, Naira, was in 8th grade and runs right up to today. It's a long haul. Naira's 6 years younger than me, the first in our family born in the US after we immigrated when I was 2. I was in college during her 8th grade year, but our family's super close. I'd visit a lot and talk on the phone, so I heard about what went down from Mom, Dad, and Naira herself. I didn't see it all firsthand. Naira was always one of those gorgeous girls who craved guys' attention, even as a kid. She was hyper-aware of her looks, how boys saw her, and obsessed over getting a boyfriend. That boyfriend showed up as a high school freshman named Torin. A 1-year age gap wasn't unusual around here. I dated a freshman as an 8th grader too, so when Naira zeroed in on him it wasn't shocking. But she got way too fixated. Torin didn't want to hang out with her, yet he kept her dangling. Just enough attention to keep her hooked without committing. It screwed with her head. Teen hormones, plus what we later learned was bipolar disorder, made his opinion of her everything. She'd call him, show up in his neighborhood, same as ours, anything to stay close, waiting for scraps of interest while he toyed with her. It shredded her self-esteem and sanity. She started sneaking out. Got hostile with us. Sure, she was spoiled, but she was also young and unstable. We couldn't keep them apart. She'd say she was at a friend's, but we knew she was sneaking to Torrens a few houses down, holding on to hope they'd end up together. Sure enough, when she hit high school, it happened. He asked her out. Dad hated him for all the pain he'd caused her pining after him. I didn't like him either. He'd strung her along until she was old enough to fit his image. Naira ignored our warnings. Mom, naively, supported it, hoping it'd settle her emotional mess and make her easier to handle. It started like most teen romances, carefree, all lovey-dovey, everything seemed fine. But soon, Torin's possessive side came out, along with subtle manipulation. Naira always had guy friends. She's naturally pretty and bubbly, which sometimes annoyed her girlfriends, but guys didn't mind, so she gravitated toward them. That's where it began. Torin freaked out whenever she hung with them, even if he was invited. Eventually, she stopped seeing them to dodge his fits. It got worse. He'd call her awful names, ask if she'd slept with them anytime she talked to the few guy friends left at school, like in passing in the halls. Soon, she had no male friends. Then he went after her girlfriends he didn't like ones with boyfriends. If she hung out with them, like at the movies, he'd complain their boyfriends might introduce her to other guys. He'd trash how they dressed and acted, telling Naira she'd be just like them if she kept it up. Their relationship was a roller coaster. You'd hear them screaming at each other over the phone while she locked herself in her room. Stories floated around about him nearly fighting guys at school for talking to her. During their frequent breakups, he'd hurl insults, call her fat, ugly, threaten her. She claimed a few times he'd hurt her physically, not hitting but shoving her into walls and stuff like that. No surprise, it pissed me off, but I couldn't convince her to ditch him. None of us could. Anytime we tried cutting off contact, they'd find a workaround. Keeping them apart was impossible. They went to the same school and she flat out refused to switch, despite how bad it got. Dad and I were fed up, telling her whenever we could that he was no good. Mom, though, got suckered by him too. She never had a son, and while it's not a great excuse, I get why she had a weak spot for him. We didn't see his behavior ourselves, just heard it from Nira and others. Mom thought Nira was dramatizing since she'd caught her in chronic lies before. Mom became an emotional crutch for Torin too. His own family was a mess. But looking back, she admits she was manipulated. College prep rolled around. Naira, like plenty of dumb young kids, shaped her future around Torin. He got a wrestling scholarship to a private university. She applied and got into a public one a few miles away. His freshman year, while she was still in high school, was a disaster, and it finally started unraveling them. He messed around with two girls at his college who loved taunting Nira, making her paranoid he was cheating behind her back. She'd confront him. He'd pull the "I'd never do that" card with some sob story. One incident stuck with me. I was home for break, knocked on her door to chat, and found her crumpled on the floor, sobbing. Not a spoiled tantrum, real gut-wrenching pain clutching her stomach. She'd called him. One of the girls answered, hinting she'd been in his room late. We thought that'd end it. Nope. He said she was helping with homework, he'd been in the bathroom, and Naira bought it. Those girls kept at it. Texts, social media posts, anything to make her doubt him. He'd spin a sad tale and she'd take him back. It was like he enjoyed using them to torture her. Disgusting. We gathered proof and took it to their soccer coach. They were on scholarships, hoping to stop it. It worked. The coach threatened to kick them off the team and yank their funding for harassing a high schooler. Naira broke up with Torin, and for a bit, it seemed over. But manipulators don't let go easy. He reached out, begged her back, even dropped out of college and moved back home to prove he was done with those girls. Things weren't the same. Not because of Nira, though. They dated on and off, and we saw more of his ugly, controlling side. She went to college. He joined the Marines. Not sure why. His whole teen life was about keeping her close, and shipping off didn't fit. Maybe he planned to trap her in some far-off state away from us. Dad and I loathed him. He knew it. She once asked Dad if he'd bless a marriage. He said he wouldn't even go to the wedding. In college, Naira blossomed. Parties, friends, decent guys who respected her. Torin hated it, bombarding her with texts and insults from California. She visited him there. He proposed. She said wait till he's done with the Marines, she wouldn't leave her state. They had a good time, but he flipped when she turned down the ring. His harassment went nuts after that. There was a Marine Corps ball, a big dance where Marines bring a date. Naira wanted to go, but Mom said no, having paid for her earlier trip. Torin took another woman instead of going solo like a decent guy in love would have. He posted every detail online, shamelessly. It crushed Naira. That was the real breaking point. They split. She crashed hard after, skipped college classes, partied nonstop, burned through her emergency savings. Something awful happened. She got drugged at a party and assaulted. I won't dig into the gory details. Even anonymously, it's not my place and it makes me sick to think about. She kept it from me for years, but Mom and Torin knew. He'd been trying to win her back since the breakup, so in her wrecked state, she told him, hoping for comfort. Instead, he called her a slut, said she brought it on herself, maybe lied about it or did it willingly. That finally snapped her out of loving him. Damage was done, though. She dropped out but got a trade cert years later and now lives decently. Torin married a 19-year-old Naira look-alike, got her pregnant fast. Within a month of meeting, a kid, under a year later. It tore Naira up. He'd text her, "I'll name my little girl after you," or "after the name we picked for our girl," just to twist the knife. She blocked him everywhere, told his wife the whole history of his manipulation and abuse. It paused the harassment for a bit, but not forever. To this day, she gets vile anonymous texts, violent, sexual threats, blaming her for what happened. We think he controls his wife's accounts, deleting messages before she sees, or she's as warped as him and joins in. I doubt that, though. She's likely just a pawn in his sick game. He's in California now with his wife and kids still, sending those twisted messages. His enlistment's up in a year. If he doesn't re-enlist, he'll come back to our state, our hometown, 5 minutes away. My biggest fear is he'll hurt Naira, or hurt Mom, Dad, and me to get to her. I've got my own place now. Naira lives with her current boyfriend. Total opposite of Torin's psycho vibe. But Mom and Dad are still in that house. I won't let him touch them or her. I hope he re-enlists and never sets foot near us again. Naira just wants to move on. We all do. Mom's long since owned her role as an enabler, admits she was wrong, manipulated, and feels awful. She told him in one of his last attempts to contact us to stop texting and showing up. He's listened to her so far. Whenever he's on leave and comes back, I dread finding something horrific at Mom and Dad's. I'm terrified he'll use his military training to track Naira and her boyfriend and do something awful. She's never gone to the cops about any of this. Hates him now, but won't hurt his wife and kid by reporting him to the Marines or police. She just wants it done, would rather ignore him. I hope she's had enough someday and calls the authorities. But for now, we're waiting. Will he stay in the Marines or not? Torin, if you ever hear this and recognize yourself, you're a sick man. Your jealousy, verbal abuse, stalking, and potential for violence will land you in jail someday. I just hope it's not for hurting my family. I won't let you. You'd better hope we never cross paths. Show up at Mom and Dad's, and I'll call the cops and protect them without a second thought. I had a solid childhood before my parents divorced. We lived in a big old house with tons of yard space and a brand new in-ground pool. I'm the middle kid, with 2 brothers, a typical suburban nuclear family setup. Our street was a mix of people, but ours was one of the few with a family. Next door was an older couple with a bunch of dogs. Across the street, another older pair who loved pranking me and my brother. Honestly, they were great to be around. This story's about Soren, though, the hermit who lived alone nearby. We'd only see him walking his dog or tossing out trash. It was weird for our street. Everyone knew each other, but no one really knew Soren. His house lights were almost never on, and as my brother recalls, he didn't go out much like the rest of us. He was home, though. His sweet Jeep Wrangler was always parked in his driveway unless he was at work. One night, my parents and I were in the dining room playing a board game when there was a knock. Our neighborhood was calm. No chaos, so Mom and Dad didn't lock the door till bedtime and never hesitated to let someone in. Dad saw it was Soren and opened up, being the friendly neighbor he was, inviting him in for a beer even though we'd never really hung out with him before. Soren sat down. I was across from him, next to Dad, feeling shy and awkward. Honestly, he'd always given me the creeps. He mentioned he knew Mom worked for a home remodeling company. Not surprising. Her company van with logos all over it was always in our driveway, and asked about her rates and such. Mom gave him her pitch. I got bored with the adult talk and bailed to watch my brother play Tony Hawk's Pro Skater on his Xbox. Soren stayed maybe an hour, left with a friendly handshake, and thanks for the beer, yada yada. After he was gone, Mom and Dad exchanged confused looks, shut the door, and Dad said how random it was, adding that Soren had a strange vibe. They figured he was just lonely with lousy social skills. After that visit, Mom started seeing him everywhere, a huge jump from barely noticing him before, when he'd just be at his house or walking his dog. It wasn't like when you buy a new car and suddenly see it everywhere. We lived in a tight-knit, small-town community, hard to go out without running into someone you know. People were friendly, waved even if they didn't know you well. If Mom had seen Soren in public before, she'd have remembered. It started normal, grocery store, gas station, Target, the bank now and then. Then she'd pull out of our driveway to go somewhere, and his red Jeep would follow right away. Like he'd wait for her to leave, hop in, and tail her. She even spotted him in the parking lot at her work once, knew it was him from his bumper stickers. It got creepier. He'd come up to her on our porch while she smoked or read, striking up the most awkward conversations. The kind where the other person's so socially clumsy it's physically painful, and you just want them gone. It happened about twice a week, and Mom started getting sketched out by his behavior. The tipping point came one day at the gym. He'd followed her there before. She'd see him on a machine behind her, staring the whole time. This time he showed up 45 minutes into her usual hour-long workout. He got on a machine behind her again, stayed for the last 15 minutes of her routine, then left when she did. She took a bizarre route home to test her hunch. Sure enough, he was right behind her the whole way. She'd had it. She came home in a total panic, told Dad that if he pulled that crap again, she'd confront him and scare him off for good. Things calmed down fast after that. For a few weeks, it was like nothing had happened. Mom started thinking he'd moved. Honor realized he was being a total weirdo. Then one night, I woke up around midnight to grab water. It was late, had to be at least that for a 10-year-old, since Mom and Dad were asleep. The house was dark, except for a little lamp we kept on the piano in the dining room. To get from my bedroom to the kitchen, I had to pass through there. That lamp faced the front porch, and across the street, Soren's house. There's also a big arched window on that side of the dining room, looking out to the street. As I walked through, I glanced left out the window, and I'll never forget what I saw. Soren was sitting on our porch in one of our chairs, staring into our house through that big window. We locked eyes at the same moment. His widened, he jumped up and ran fast back across the street to his place. It scared me so bad I never told Mom and Dad. I know that's dumb, but I was 10. I was afraid they wouldn't believe me, or worse, they would, and Dad would go over there and mess Soren up. I did my best to push it out of my mind. He stopped bothering Mom after that. About 2 years later, my parents divorced. We moved out of that house, and he never got his place remodeled, far as I know. I don't live there anymore, but I hope I never see Soren again. This went down when I was in 8th or 9th grade, a few years back. I had 2 friends I'll call Kian and Zara. Zara was head over heels for Kian, crazy, obsessive. She'd snap at anyone who got too close to him, like she had dibs. It made our whole friend group uneasy. Kian was a nice guy, didn't judge her for it, but he'd gripe to me about how her protectiveness got under his skin. Within a year of them meeting, stuff got really weird. Whenever I hung out with them, Zara would stare daggers at me if I stood too near Kian or accidentally touched him, like a brush of the arm. I'd just figured out I was a lesbian, so I had no romantic interest in him. Definitely wasn't flirting. I told Kian about it. He said she pulled that with everyone, even his straight guy buddies, and he was sick of it too. I started avoiding Zara, not inviting her out, hoping she'd drop off. Stupid plan. We were 13 and had no clue how to handle it maturely. A few weeks after we started dodging her, my school email got flooded with links to sketchy, inappropriate websites. Total freakout. I used that email for all my school stuff, like final presentation submissions. I had to set up a new one and transfer everything over. A massive pain. Things quieted down for a bit, then anonymous threats hit my Facebook inbox. Nasty, messed up stuff. It didn't seem that bad at first, but I was 13, and one message described brutally killing my pet while explaining how to get into my backyard. That scared the hell out of me. I told Kian. He'd been getting odd messages too. At first it was love poems, songs, and stories about him. He told the sender to cut it out or he'd call the cops. Just a bluff, and it stopped for a while. Then it came back. Threats they'd hurt themselves with pics of self-harm sent to him. We were both freaked but too dumb to tell our parents. Thought we'd somehow get in trouble, you know how kids think. It dragged on for months, getting crazier. Kian and I finally deleted our Facebooks to make it stop. Whatever we'd been getting quit after that. We hadn't seen Zara anywhere. Not at school, not the local park. Weird for a small town. One day, Kian and I planned to hang out after school, walking to his place. We'd meet under this tree, by the parent pickup line. I left my class, got close, and saw him talking to someone. I slowed down. It was an argument. Kian's chill, I'd never heard him yell before. As I got nearer, I saw him, ears red, pissed off, yelling at Zara. She looked different. Paler in long, baggy clothes, despite it being 110°F out. I caught him shouting, "Stop harassing me and my friends, you're freaking crazy." Even with him screaming in her face, she had this creepy smile like a forced photo grin, saying, "It's been a while. I miss you." I couldn't hear her full reply. Sped up to reach Kian. He looked relieved when I got there, said, "Let's go." And we booked it toward his house. I glanced back at Zara. Smile gone, glaring at me, face twisted, dark circles and sunken features standing out. She yelled something about my cat as we left. I caught up to Kian, asked what happened. He was quiet, cracking his knuckles, a stress tick, while we walked. I didn't push, we dropped it and played video games at his place till late. I walked home around 6 p.m. Sun setting, but it'd take another hour to fully go down. Knew I'd make it back before dark. Got home, house empty, warmed up dinner, crashed. Next morning I woke up and realized my cat wasn't on my bed. Odd, since she always slept with me. Figured she was eating downstairs, checked her dish. Last night's dinner untouched. A bad feeling hit, but I shook it off. Made breakfast. And lunch, walked 5 minutes to the school bus stop. All good. Except Kian seemed off. After algebra, he said he needed to talk after school, meet at the tree again. I said sure, asked if he'd seen my cat. She wandered the neighborhood sometimes. He went pale, shrugged. I was annoyed he didn't take it seriously, went to class. School ended, I met him. I was worked up. Asked where my cat was. He didn't speak at first, looked uneasy. I pressed. He pulled out his iPod Touch, showed me a bloody photo. A severed cattail, my cat's collar soaked in blood, a sticky note. I started crying. He said he found it at his back door. Note read, "Kian cheated on them, this is revenge." He apologized, said more, but I zoned out. I snapped back when he mentioned Zara. said she must have done it. He recapped their fight. She'd admitted she was behind the weird messages to him and our friends being stalked too. She'd ranted about being his girlfriend, swore she'd get back at me. I remembered her cat comment when I'd left for his place. We were terrified. That day we went to my house, couldn't stop checking the windows for Zara. After a week we noticed she was gone. Asked around, no one had seen her except one girl I barely knew. She said Zara moved to another state, didn't know why, but Zara was furious about it. All contact with her stopped. Keon got unsigned love letters for another year. We drifted apart. I don't know if they kept coming. All I know is, Zara, if you're still out there where I grew up, watch out. I'm coming for you. This happened a few years ago in my small town, when I got my first real job, not babysitting, at 15 at a local restaurant. I worked there till I was 17. I was tight with an assistant manager, Leora, who was like a second mom, always made sure I was taken care of. The place had a rough rep but drew locals, regulars, and tourists, so it was busy every night. I got hit on by creepy old guys plenty, usually travelers passing through, though a few regulars I had to steer clear of too. This story's not about them, it's about a coworker. If you've worked in service, you know back-of-house food prep dishwashers don't always get the cream of the crop. They're often folks with shaky pasts who'll work cheap, so that's who gets hired. Our restaurant didn't bother with background checks, so the back was full of middle-aged pothead pervs who made me uneasy from the jump. I learned to deal overtime. But the summer before I quit, they hired this guy, Dax. I was 16, a sophomore. He was maybe 6'7", all muscle with a face that screamed trouble. You wouldn't want to meet him in a dark alley. He was probably in his 30s, but drugs had aged him fast. Stressed out look, twitchy. Word was he'd fought in underground MMA before landing there. The second I saw him, I knew I didn't want to know him. A few weeks in, things got strange. I was one of the few women under 30 there, forced to wear tight server pants that showed off my figure. The main reason I caught attention from the lonely stoners in back. Dax joined in. It started with stares, longer, creepier than the usual ones I'd get passing through. Then he'd follow me to the back room, stand there silent, smirking weirdly when I'd turn and catch him watching. It went on a month before. He got brazen, coming up behind me when we were alone, whispering filthy stuff in my ear, laughing when I told him to get lost. Yeah, I told Leora, and she took me seriously. She'd hired me, but she only oversaw front staff. Back of house answered to a creep who'd harassed me too. Even gave me a disgusting nickname tied to my body I won't repeat. She couldn't make Dax listen. Her hands were tied. I was stuck. I needed the cash with 7 siblings and wanted to support myself. It was the only job close enough for my parents to drop me off or me to drive to once I got my license. Dax got worse. My guy friends there said he'd ask personal stuff about me. What school I went to, if I had a boyfriend where I lived. He knew it was near since I'd change at work, what I was doing after shifts. One time I found my clothes bag rifled through. The only thing missing was a bra I'd packed to change into for a night out. I could only assume it was him. The breaking point came when he groped me reaching for a high shelf. I lost it, burst into tears, ran to Leora. She agreed it was enough. I was like everyone's little sister there. Most older waiters and hosts looked out for me. If someone bugged me, they'd step in. Leora cursed Dax out, told him to leave, me alone. From then on, I wouldn't go to the back without her or another guy I trusted with me. That cooled his interest, or so I thought. What really cemented my fear of him hit a few weeks before I quit. Closing shift, just me, Leora, a few others, Dax, and our head manager Miri, the sweetest woman alive. saw the best in everyone. She'd been giving Dax small cash for bus fare the past few weeks, but that night, she told him she had to stop. She knew he might be buying drugs and it could cost her job. He went ballistic, screamed, loomed over her, called her awful names, threw papers and whatever he could grab off her desk. I heard the commotion from the next room, stepped out just as he flung her office door open in a rage. He locked eyes with me, pure hate, and said, "If you tell anyone what you saw, you'll regret it." He was clearly high. His fury and tone shook me to my core. I went in. Mary was crying, begged me not to leave her alone with him. I stayed, and she drove me home, thanking me for being there when she needed me. That's when I knew how unpredictable and violent he could be. I quit after getting my license, found a barista job at a local coffee shop, worked there almost 2 months, never thinking about that old gig or Dax. Then one night, starting my shift at 6 p.m., late December, pitch black outside, raining, I pulled into the lot. My new job was in a strip with other stores, but the parking was dark, creepy with the weather. One streetlight glowed near the far end by my building. I saw a figure there, froze. I'd know that silhouette anywhere. Dax, standing in the path, from my car to the door facing me. I could see his gross smirk even in the dim light. His license had been revoked before. He'd hitched rides or bussed home from the restaurant, so I had no clue how he got there. My shop was at the end of the row. Past it was just dumpsters. No reason for him to be there unless he meant to come in. My mind raced as I stared at the guy who'd tormented me for months, threatened me too. "Finally found you," he said. I sprinted the last few feet to the cafe, locked myself in the bathroom, had a panic attack, called Leora for the first time in months, and spilled everything. Since then, he's shown up at my work off and on. Every time I'd freak, find any excuse to bail, avoiding eye contact, his winks from across the lobby. I told my current manager my history with him, so whenever he came in, easy to spot, they'd send me to the back. I'm so thankful to work somewhere that actually cares and doesn't tolerate the harassment or assault I dealt with at my first job. I hate that I went through that starting at 16, but it forced me to grow up fast and learn to stand up for myself. To any young women out there, if someone's treating you like this, you don't have to take it alone. Do what's best for you. Nothing's worth living in fear. You're worth more than that.